So Alyssa, what's on your radar?
Crime is rising across the country, and specifically violent crime. In 2020 alone, the United States saw nearly 25% more homicides than the previous year, according to preliminary data released by the FBI. This represents the largest single-year increase in homicides since at least 1960. To put a finer point on it, yes, crime is rising across the nation, but more specifically, murder is rising across the nation. All the while, progressive activists continue to call for defunding the police. Last week, Representative Cori Bush set off a firestorm after saying on air that she needed to have private security to protect her, but that we, ordinary Americans, need to defund the police. The comment was widely mocked, and mainstream Democrats tried to create distance from the policy. But her perspective is, in fact, not far from where the progressive wing of her party is. And the defund the police progressives are making an extraordinary impact. In 2020, defund the police efforts resulted in $840 million in direct cuts to U.S. police departments. Think about that. While homicides are on the rise nationally, our police departments are facing massive cuts. In D.C. alone, $15 million was cut from the policing budget, all while crime surges in D.C. In 1 week alone in Washington, D.C. this past June, there were 3 murders and at least 6 shootings in 24 hours. Now, I don't want to oversimplify this debate and say all we need is funding for the police. Violent crime is a result of countless sociological, environmental, familial, and economic factors. But it's certainly valid to note that crime is on the rise while cities and localities are actively being pushed to cut funding to the very men and women who protect them. And sadly, it's a well-documented fact that morale within the policing community is low, especially after egregious examples of police misconduct like the murder of George Floyd. Rightly, policing in general was heavily critiqued nationwide. But even as the bad police officers were brought to justice or are in the process of it, the demonizing of good police in many circles never stopped. Further, reports suggest that the increase in violent crimes and violent protests around the country are a factor in officers choosing to leave the force. Why stand by and be demonized and risk their life is the question. One poll found a startling 45% increase in retirements among police officers and 20% increase in resignations in 2020 to 2021 compared to 2019. While the defund the police mantle is currently held by progressives like Cori Bush, who believe in security for themselves but not for American communities, some Republicans have some answering to do as well for low policing morale. Following the horrific January 6th insurrection, many Capitol Police and D.C. Metropolitan Police are seeking to retire or resign from the force. In fact, in the immediate aftermath of January 6th, as of March 2021, 70 officers had retired from the force. And can you blame them? Policing in this country is not an easy issue. We need to have real bipartisan discussion about de-escalation tactics, the use of force, ensuring police departments are diverse and look like the communities they serve, and much more. But the answer has never been that we should defund the police. The rise in crime we are currently seeing is violent. We can't deploy de-escalation officers to potential homicides. In the case of D.C., the city reallocated the policing funds to community-based violence interruption program. But residents are saying they have done virtually nothing to reduce homicides or gun violence. No surprise. And because I thought it was important to go straight to the horse's mouth and look up the Defund the Police movement's proposal to address violent crime without police, it's a muddled, vague, nonsensical proposal that suggests something like detectives and sociologists will stop violent crimes. It reads, quote, instead of relying on police, we could rely on investigators from other sectors to carry out investigations, social workers, sociologists, forensic scientists, doctors, researchers, and other well-trained individuals to fulfill our needs when violent crimes take place. Police intervention into ongoing violent crime is rare, but even in the event that intervention is required while violent crime is ongoing, a service that provides expert specialized rapid response does not need to be connected to an institution of policing that fails in every other respect, such as a specialized service does not require the billions of dollars we waste in effective policing from year to year. I mean, what does that even mean? A lot of words saying functionally nothing. It almost seems like they haven't really thought it through. So long as violent crime surges, Americans need policing, just as Representative Cori Bush confirmed in her on-air comments. When people are in danger, they call for help. For now, that's the police. So let's give them the funding and the training they need to serve communities across America. Ryan, I assume you have a different take on this.
A little bit. But I do think the left needs to be careful about the way that neoliberalism, which is defined by its hostility to public spaces and to the government, by the way that neoliberalism can infect even progressive social movements. And so if instead of thinking about police, you think about public security versus private security, then people on the left are going to prefer public security over private security. And so if that's the case, then you have to work backwards from there. And I do think that policing in this country is failing in a lot of ways. And anything that fails so spectacular that it brings people out into the streets in the millions does need to be reimagined. And so if you reimagined policing, public policing from the ground up, you could see a version of what they're talking about with a detective force. Now, I don't think that we need to draft doctors and nurses into solving violent crime, because then you're going to have a disincentive to go get, for people to go get help. And you don't want snitches all over the place. Like that's not the society that we want. But you could have a detective force whose charge is simply solving violent crime, rather than merging them in with the rest of the police force, which is so distrusted by the community that they can't do interviews with people because nobody wants to be seen talking to the police, and so then they can't solve crimes, and then it just spirals from there. When it comes to traffic stops, we don't our parking meter people don't walk around necessarily armed and looking for people with warrants out. They're looking to give parking tickets. So our traffic enforcement, why do those people have to be armed and have to be charged with arresting somebody if they happen to come up in a database? The detective force could be charged. If somebody has a warrant and you seriously care about affecting that warrant, then have the detective force go out and find that person. It's not hard in this society anymore to find somebody. And so a huge number of the violent incidents that we see between police officers and the public occur during traffic stops. So just eliminate those.
Well, and I think those are valid points. And I say half of what I was saying in that is tongue-in-cheek, because I actually don't think the broad swath of the Democratic Party actually wants to defund the police. And I think if Speaker Pelosi never had to hear that phrase again, it would be too soon. It will almost certainly hurt Democrats in midterms. But there is this element within the Progressive Party, which you're, I'm sure, very familiar with, that truly believes this. And some of what you talk through, arguably makes sense. I would say you would have to look at different communities, different situations. There's no one size fits all. But the notion that when you have violent crime on the rise, violent crime which is usually responded to with some kind of an intervention, not just the detective force after to determine what happened, what is the solution if you don't have police? So other than the most extreme abolitionists, and that's probably fewer than 1% of the population, I think the people who still embrace the language feel like the system is so broken that it needs some type of inflammatory slogan thrown up against it to shake it up, so that then it can be reformed. And that they don't actually mean zero policing. But that is the problem with a slogan. If you have to back up and explain that it doesn't mean what it sounds like it means, then you probably have a problem with your slogan. Well, exactly. And I do worry about the morale factor, that we don't, policing was something that at one time, like being a fireman, was something that people aspired to do. And you'd have, young men and women who it was something they wanted to do. But there's so much criticism around policing that I think we're not going to be recruiting young people into it. And my other fear is that police forces will start to look even less like the communities they serve. And something that I think we all learned in the aftermath of many of the egregious over-policing violations and tragic situations like George Floyd's murder is when you have a force that looks like the communities they serve, you're far less likely to have these racial, based crimes take place. And I do worry that low morale and a lack of incentive, if we're demonizing the police, they're seen as people in the community you shouldn't trust, you're not going to build communities that look like, with policing that look like them.
Although some of this is on the police because they've positioned themselves as occupiers and are now resentful of the fact that they are treated like occupiers. The root of this is in some ways in the militarization of the police that happened over the last several decades. You now have police officers who don't talk about shifts; they talk about tours. I have a 12-hour tour today. Get out of here! You don't have a 12-hour tour. It's a shift. Stop calling it a tour. And part of it is we had these forever wars, and so many people return from these forever wars, and see this as a new combat realm. And the ones who didn't go on tour are oftentimes even worse because that now they're just play acting, LARPing as like soldiers.
I would say my libertarian side has always had some hesitation about arming police officers with military-grade weapons. But then we do look at this last year and the riots that we had over the summer where you had buildings being burned down, people being shot in their stores that they own trying to defend themselves, massive rises in crime, massive looting and violence taking place. And the average police officer isn't necessarily armed with what they need to both de-escalate but also to stop violent situations. Right. Is there an in-between?
Well, it was extremely rare during those situations that police intervention de-escalated. And almost in every case, if you rolled it back to the beginning, it was the police intervention that actually escalated the situation to where it was, or saboteurs and provocative folks who were like inside the crowd.
Well, in reality, I would say in most of those cases, those riots tended to just fizzle out over time because policing couldn't stop it. They didn't have what they needed to stop these violent riots. But what about the tens of thousands of dollars in businesses that lost income, lives that were lost during it? I mean, we need to have a force that's able to secure our communities. There's a reasonable in-between, but I would say I hope the Cori Bushes are not the future of this movement. I think that reasonable Republicans and Democrats can deal with policing in our country. And
along with the militarization, you got this ideological hardening of the police. They are now. If you read through police Facebook threads, you're like, good Lord. Like this is a hardcore ideological faction that now sees itself as separate and distinct from the community, and when you're in that situation, it's going to be very difficult for the community to see them any differently than they see themselves.
Well, and the one thing I want to end on, and I noted this in my radar, is giving a shout out to the Capitol Police and DC Metropolitan Police, who I think came up against both right-wing criticism of those who were in favor of what was taking place on January 6th, but then the rampant left-wing anti-policing rhetoric. And now you have heroes who literally ran to defend our Capitol, to protect our democratic process, risked their lives in doing so, faced egregious injuries, and now they're kind of in this no man's land of the right doesn't seem to support me, nor does the left. I would hope that we could all come together and agree that at least those police officers are heroes. They did do the right thing, and our democracy thanks them for it.
Yeah, and they were badly failed by their leadership, who just needed to call out more security, and it never would have happened.
Well, agree there. Greater funding for our police in D.C. would not be a bad thing.
Team Rising joins us next to dig deeper into vaccine mandates. Stick with us.